Glad to. So yes, I'm Dave McPherson, and I am a program manager currently on the Office 365 security team. I moved over there August-ish. Last time I did this talk, actually, I did it, I think, for this audience, or for this version, last year's version of this audience. Yeah, so I was working on the Windows security team since 2001, and prior to that I worked in support for security, primarily on authorization technologies, as Michiko said. But of course, authorization and authentication are pretty locked together, so there's a little bit of overlap, but just enough to hand off the baton, so to speak, and I think it'll help kind of bring things together. I'm going to ask, since I'm really going to try to get through this in 45 minutes, I'm going to ask if there's questions at kind of the end of each little segment. I think that'll be a good way to kind of pace through the talk. We'll see how it goes. So goal here. How many people have heard of DAC? I'm sure by now a few. 2? Oh, okay, 3, 4, 5. Okay, a few people have heard of DAC. That's good. Dynamic access control. Well, the goal here, since it sounds like maybe some of you are either shy or haven't heard of it, so we'll go through kind of a quick intro of what it is at a high level, and then we'll go kind of layer by layer into deeper stuff, right, about dynamic access control. And some of it towards the end will overlap with what Michiko said. But in a good way, I think, in that you'll kind of see how the stuff integrates into DAC, the Kerberos stuff. And we'll also talk a little bit about token bloat, since there was questions on that. That might be interesting. So what is dynamic access control? That doesn't sound like an actual feature, because it's not. It's kind of more of a bucket of several different features, or an initiative. We broke it down into kind of, first off, the scenarios that motivated dynamic access control. The first is data classification. That's kind of a continually growing kind of product need space that involves getting data classified. And you can imagine the need for this as we have reams and reams, or I should say disks and disks of unstructured data that's just been thrown on file shares for years and years. And that causes problems. We can't just delete it. There's assets there. But we do have to figure out ways to identify what's there and secure it. So there's enhancements there, and we'll talk about that. And then there's expression-based conditions. Now, Michiko talked about this. We'll go deep into what these are. So if you have any kind of, I don't know, ambiguity about what those are, that's where we're going to spend a chunk of this. It's kind of like the center of dynamic access control, right? But it amounts to using these conditional expressions, and security, it says groups here, but security groups and claims to give either access or audit policies. And to do so from a central location, right, which is yet another kind of vector, which we'll go into. Next is expression-based auditing. So the same expression technology that's going to give us access control based on expressions will also be used to give us more precise auditing, which will be helpful when because one of the main reasons people don't use auditing as much as we would like to is because of the volume, right? And this helps you get your arms around that. And then lastly is encryption, right? So this, you'll see a lot here about how do we get the policy right for the files as they sit on the file server. What about when people actually open them up and they're in Word, or they go into email, right? And that is going to be about getting them RMS encrypted based on these classifications, okay? So those are all kind of scenarios. I didn't mention really specifically core technologies there. And so this slide is kind of translating that into what are the kind of technologies that we're going to touch or introduce in order to do that. So consider this the first splash of primer, right? And we'll drill into each of these, but this will give us the kind of the terms and the high-level concepts. First is user and device claims. Probably not new to anybody now, this notion of claims. But I like to ask, can anybody name a Microsoft product that's used claims since roughly 2005-ish? Yeah, I was thinking of something else. Our kind of premier, at least in the security space framework of using claims. ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. You guys heard of that? Okay, it's a good way for me to test the crowd in terms of who, what I'm talking to, whether I'm talking to IT guys or people that have focused on protocols maybe, or people that have focused on, I don't know, application connectivity. Expression-based ACEs, I mentioned those actually, ACEs with conditions, right? They're going to use Boolean logic in order to give access control, okay, define access control and auditing. And we'll go deep into that, so I don't have to here. Classification enhancements. I know you guys have heard of FCI, File Classification Infrastructure. There's enhancements there that came in Server 2012 that we will go over and show how they, they're a big part. They're kind of the vertical scenario for all this dynamic access control at present. And then central access and audit policies. Those are new in terms of how we can kind of use these central policies in order to control access. Why would we want to do that? And to what degree are we going to do that? And then access denied assistance. We have a bit on that. Not going to go heavily into access denied assistance or remediation. So I'll just tell you what that is in Windows Server 2012. Is that traditionally, if you're working with a file server, you click on a link and you open up the share and you click on a file and you don't have access denied. You're just dead, right? You just literally stopped. There was no really way to do anything unless you happen to know the group or the person that managed that file server, right? Now you probably remember SharePoint has this cool request access by clicking here thing. That's kind of what this is. It allows the administrator to give you some text to say, to maybe self-remediate, such as, oh, silly me, I forgot to use my smart card, and this requires a smart card. Or click here to request access, right? Then again, we're not going to go deep into that, but that's a pretty neat, long time coming feature. So the core, kind of if you get one thing out of dynamic access control, you got to get the expressions. And if you're familiar with the notion of conditional logic and conditional expressions, they're not hard to get. Now they might, if you're thinking about this from an ACL perspective, they might bend your brain a little bit, but don't. These are just granting access based on expressions and claims, right? Now, what goes into the expressions? Imagine most conditional expressions are based on these kind of logical terms, right? Kind of the syntax of these are going to involve user claims, device claims, and resource properties, right? And now examples of user claims are what's already in Active Directory, things like the department that you're in, things like maybe some custom tag for your clearance level, right? Stuff that's already there in many cases, and of course it's an extensible schema, so you can add stuff, right? And then device claims. At this point, not huge, but I imagine will actually probably become very important as we go forward, because if BYOD does truly become the new model, for example, before I can open up an important document, HBI, on a device, somebody's going to want us to make sure that device has got some level of security, right? Does it have the right antivirus software? Are its signatures up to date? Does it have BitLocker enabled? All that stuff is going to become really important, I believe, in the future. In fact, it's kind of weird that it isn't, that you can open up a finance HBI document from a file from a computer that's completely unknown to the admin in terms of its security threshold. And then resource properties. Notice that they're not called resource claims. And that's just because they are not speaking about a principle. And we're just trying to be kind of crisp in the language. Schema-wise, they look very similar to a claim. They're just a trusted statement about a resource. Okay? And they could be very similar in terms of, resource department equals finance. Right. Yes?
What's used by resource properties is, to me, at least at first glance, when I think of the resource property, I think of the ACL. The ACL is, I mean, whatever it is that's unique about the resource is embedded in the ACL.
You're correct. Yes. And we'll get in exactly into where in the ACL and so on.
But it's not something that's generated by the client and transferred across the network.
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't repeat the question. The question is, I'm going to interpret your question. How does the resource property kind of fit against the ACL? The ACL is where we keep stuff about the file or the object, the securable object. And in part, I'm going to hold off because you're going to see exactly how it fits into the ACL. It does fit into the ACL. It just extends the ACL with something that's a little more schematized, a little more flexible, so that we can now say greater than 27, whereas before you can only say group, sort of thing. And now these come together into an access policy. Wait, one question, yes?
So I'm reading these policies, right? So if let's say I had a development circle, I would not be able to copy my finance document onto something that said resource marketing development for my potential.
You're getting slightly ahead of me, and you're looking at this policy here, and you're saying if you interpret that policy correctly. Okay, let me catch everybody up. So his question was what if I had a resource equals development based on this policy? So let me introduce this policy, because there's an important thing that I got to introduce. This applies to. You see that? Applies to part up there at the kind of the top of the green policy thing. Applies to resource.impact equals high. What I'm calling that is an applicability predicate. Is that a cool name? It kind of sucks and it's a mouthful, but I can't think of a better way to later in the deck refer you back to this other than the applies to field or something like that. This says what data the policy applies to. If that data has an impact, if the resource property, if it has a resource property that says the impact is equal to high, then this policy will apply. Okay? If not, this steps into the background completely and does not affect access control one way or the other. So if it's engineering, this just doesn't apply. Okay? But what it's saying here is this is an allow case, to use security descriptor terminology, and it allows read and write permissions if the user's department claim is equal to the resources department claim. See that? There's kind of a runtime fix-up going on there. That's the flexible, or that's the dynamic and dynamic access control. And device.managed equals true. So now we're saying something about the device here. Somebody has run some health software or something, or maybe issued the device from an IT department and is somehow testing to see if it's in a managed state. And they have a tag in Active Directory on that device as managed equals true. Okay? So that if that's the case, user's department is equal to whatever the resources department is and the device is managed, then they could have read-write access. Okay? That's a policy, or an access policy. Now, users and user device claims, this slide looks intimidating. It's not really. This is just kind of showing why we did claims, why not just groups and stuff, and kind of the benefits of claims. Now, we already talked about how claims have been around. ADFS and others have used claims for at least or somewhere around 2005. And some of these reasons, you might say, hey, you could have done that with groups. And that's true. It's just claims are kind of really more flexible groups, right? In fact, a group is kind of a claim. It's just a sit. Group sit equals S-1- blah, 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 right? So it's really just a more flexible, schematized group, or the group is a specific claim. Claims are more flexible and schematized, which will allow some really cool policies like the one we just saw on the last page, on the last slide. Okay, so prior to having claims, user and device claims, we were restricted to making policy decisions based on groups. Now, what that really means is ORs. We were restricted to ORs. You're in this group, or this group, or this group, or this group. And just having ORs means you have to have lots of ORs, or you have to do a lot of very kind of clever group management, for which there was clever group management tools, but it's complex to get everything into. You can't always do it, especially when you're trying to use the attributes of a device. You can't always do it. And how do you say that the user is in this group and their device happens to be managed? Because you don't even, at the time that you're making that app, you don't even know what device they're coming from. Really hard to do. Impossible in some cases. The other thing is shadow groups are often created to use what are kind of already existing attributes in Active Directory, right? We already have department, we already have title, we already got dozens of other attributes up there, and companies are, for their LOB apps and stuff, are putting in their custom attributes, and yet we can't use them in ACLs, right? That's kind of a wart that's been there for a long time, that in order to use those, you had to turn around and make a group populated based on whoever had that attribute, right? So this takes care of that. They have rules around who can be members of which type. Now, groups do. Now, if you remember, if you've been in the IT admin space, then you had to wrestle with the doc that talks about how you take users and put them in universal groups or domain groups, and then those can go into domain local groups, and then those can go into machine local groups, and then those can go on files. And there are scenarios where that you might not want to do that. And then there's even scenarios where after doing all that, it wouldn't quite work because of the authentication protocol that came into play. So while those are cool in that they do allow for some kind of lazy binding of groups and stuff, right? They also created complexity. That I was authorization PM for well, goodness, 15 years, and I still had to go back and refer to that thing. I never got that down pat, and I might have just now quoted it wrong. So the point is, it was complex, and at least while this doesn't have all the kind of lazy, kind of late binding capabilities of that, at least it's simple. These are stuck to a user or a device, okay, and they go where the user or device goes. And there's no way to transform groups across AD boundaries. We could have done that. Could have, we had a notion of filtering, but remember those groups are pretty tightly coupled with the domain, right? And at least the forest, right? If you remember, a group is it's the ID of the security domain that it's from plus a RID, which is just an increment of its issuance, right? That's pretty stuck to that domain. If it goes too far in the world, nobody's going to know really what that reference is unless there's some global, domain lookup. And we don't want that because we don't want people necessarily peeking back into our domain to see what that group name is, right? So while we could have had group transformation, it's not clear that it would have been the right thing to do or what the right way to do it would have been. Whereas with claims, it's a new green field. We can just make the rules as we go, right? And no way to control access based on the characteristics of a device. Again, arguably we could have done that with groups, device groups, but and we do, in fact. This is kind of a superset of that. Okay. Now with these, claims can be used in file server directly in file server permissions. Consistently issued to all users in a forest. I've kind of made that point. Transformed across trust boundaries. And the transformation is kind of like what you would see if you're familiar with Active Directory Federation services. But this is nice because they can go from one kind of dictionary from, say, big company X to big company Y, and they can have a completely different name there, or one group could transform into 7 groups, or 7 groups could be needed to get one claim, right? So it's more than just transform the name from Boeing to Southwest Airlines. It's much more flexible than that. And then of course enable new types of policies, right? Now this one here is kind of interesting. Allow write access if a user is a member of the finance group. This is all groups now. Note that this isn't claims. This is something you can use without introducing a single claim into your environment. If the user is a member of the finance group and the user is a member of the full-time employee group and the device they're coming from is managed. is in the managed group, let's say. Okay? So, you can see, how would you do that with groups? Well, I can imagine it with just groups, with just ORs, right? We'd have to come up with a group for finance full-time employees, and we all did that, right? Point here is you don't have to. You can have a group called finance folks and a group called FTEs, and then put them, and you get the virtual group right here, right? And then how would you add the device manage equals true? Well, I don't know that it would be worth doing. It would be so hard. Okay, so now let's drill into how this can kind of help in the future. The point here is that I'm making is that OR leads to a thing called group bloat. Now, we had to make groups that arguably ought not have been needed because of the attributes in Active Directory. And then two, we just talked about how, in addition to having an FTE group and a finance group, now we have a FTE finance group, right? Because we have to get things all into this group object so that we can give access precisely to that set of people. Basically, every subset of people that we want to grant access to, we have to get into a group, right? And that leads to, this is actually a downplayed scenario. I've worked with 2 customers that have had this problem. But this is a scenario that should illustrate how we think we could save on group bloat. So consider a scenario in which there are 500 projects, 100 countries, and 10 divisions. And in order to do that, to slice and dice that such that the person on Project Foo in the UK in the finance division, right? That matrix works out to 500,000 total groups, right? And then now, like I said, I've worked with people who've tried to do that. And we'll talk about group bloat later or token bloat later, but what happens is that folks can't log on to get that many groups, right? And it becomes just a nightmare to manage, right? That can decrease down to effectively a single statement and much less groups, right? Just using groups, forget claims at this point, just using groups, if we have a project group and a country group and a division group, we can get this down to one statement that says, using the AND operator instead of OR, right? That if a members of Project Z and of UK and of engineering, they can have modify access. So now that turns from 500,000 down to 610 groups. And that's just using groups. So no change in Active Directory other than that we're using less groups. Now, if we were to use claims for this, in Active Directory, there would be 3 user claims potentially. We could say and then on the resources, we had resource properties that corresponded to those claims, right? So I should have 3 user claims and 3 resource properties there. We could have if user.division equals resource.division and user.project equals resource.project, right? And user.country equals resource.country. Now all those go away. We're down to those 6 objects, okay? Now, I should point out here that this will not happen the day did not happen the day that Dynamic Access Control released. And that's because so many resource managers still use groups other than file server, and we can't just get rid of a bunch of groups. And as you guys know, it's hard to get rid of a group, right? But we see going forward how you can lay out kind of a group model that will decrease the usage of groups. Now, going a little deeper, I mentioned the AND operator and how much bang for buck we get out of that. So in this conditional expression language, we also have these other operators. Now note that I have 2 categories here, logical and relational, and those are just kind of traditional conditional operator stuff. Logical is where you take basically what's already been figured out to be an AND, or to be a true or a false, or an unknown, and compare them. So true or true is true. True and false is false. So this is why and or not are just logical operators. Relational operators are those that look at a semantic value of a claim or the membership of a group, and you know a little bit about that thing, like a number, like an integer, and say 7 greater than 8, true, right? Or false, right? And those are then going to be consumed by a logical operator into some trueness or falseness of the entire expression. Yes? I'm sorry?
The expression type is so if I define it as more than the email more than 7. I'm going to check it. That check the name type in.
Well, yes and no. So I will say time itself is, okay, so the question, repeating the question, are these expressions time safe? Or is time... type. Oh, sorry. Oh. Oh, well, then I just tried to answer a harder question than that one. Yes, they're type safe. And that you can read the spec, and each one of those operators takes certain types, right? Am I going to check it when we do the access check? Policy, yes. If you use our tools, yes. You can construct, if you go low enough, a security descriptor that has a syntax problem. But yeah, our tools will enforce the type. And since so I'm not sure I actually repeated the question. Are they type safe? And then the other question I was talking about time. Now I probably perked some interest. I can punt that because I'm no longer in the Windows security group. No, I'm kidding. So that's something that we're working on. It's not there yet, such as time a day greater than, don't release access to this file until, June 1st, and no longer than, June 30th. That's not there yet. Customers have asked for it, and we, as in they, are working on it. And then conditional expressions. Now, this slide is probably too low for every other audience except for this one, because this is where you guys will have to actually, if you're trying to interop, this is where you would have to kind of the rubber hits the road. How did this fit into Windows first off? So it turns out there was this kind of old, ancient feature called a auth-z callback ace that was introduced in Server 2003, which allowed for applications allowed for a consuming application to have some application data, its own semantics, put at the end of a security descriptor, or I'm sorry, of an ace. And this type was called a callback ace. Okay? And then at runtime, they could give access check a callback, and it would call that back. They'd take that data, and they'd do whatever they want with it. Maybe it's go check the stock market, or check something in Active Directory. Go check what the user's title, maybe. Well, it wasn't widely used. In fact, it was almost not used. We used it, but it was almost not used as far as I know. And however, we did train the existing resource managers to, if you see that, don't break, right? So file server saw it, didn't break. Active Directory saw it, didn't break. Registry saw it, didn't break, right? It would fail or ignore safely, but it didn't crash, right? Well, see, one of the kind of nervousness people had when they saw this feature was, goodness, what are you guys doing to ACLs? You're going to break the world, right? And this is why we're not, because this already plumbed all the servers back to 2000. Even, in fact, we backported that to 2000.
I broke those.
We didn't break the world. Well, we could talk about a particular scenario, but yeah. That allowed us to not break the whole world, right? Now, in terms of how it integrates into the system, there's that ace, right? And then I have here. Folks seen SDDL before? Who knows and heard of SDDL? Yeah, that's actually kind of, if you're an IT person who's done ACLs, you probably know SDDL. It's a security descriptor definition language, text-based. And it was invented like just prior to server, Windows 2000. So it's ancient. In fact, if we had released it a few years later, it would have been XSDDL, because we would have probably done it in XML. But it predates that. But you can see humans caught on, and you can actually read these. And let's read this first one here. Normal ACE says it's an allow ACE, and it's a container inherit, object inherit ACE. See that CI and OI. And it's giving generic call or full control to AU, authenticated users. So you can see how people caught on to these pretty quick, right? It's very terse. You can even pivot it vertically and show them vertically, and it looks like the Matrix thing, if you remember that. A guy wrote a security, a screensaver to actually crawl your disk drive and show those, and it was pretty cool. And look for bad, security descriptors. It was a security feature. But in order to introduce this new callback ACE, all we did is we created this new ACE type, which is really just an extension of the conditional of the callback ACE. It looks exactly the same, right? But now it just has, instead of being a allow ACE, it's a conditional allow ACE, and it has this conditional expression shoved into it, right, in text. Now, that's a very specific sort of text, which you can read about in MSD type. But yeah, I mean, you could almost read it right off the page there. If you're kind of familiar with C++, then you see that those operators look familiar, right? So that's how it all fits in, really, into the system. Yes?
I think it's implied, but these support deny as well as allow.
Actually, good question, and no. Denies have, so the question is, do these support deny, deny ACEs? And the answer is no, we purposely did not. It's either to give than it is to take away. So we reserve the right to later support deny ACEs with conditional expressions. But for now, we decided not to. As you know, deny ACEs create problems. If you imagine the Venn diagram of access control, it gets hard, because remember, ACEs are ordered. Security descriptor ACLs, I should say, are ordered. And there's this thing called canonical ordering, and we typically put deny ACEs in front of allow ACEs. So if you come up with a scenario, I want to deny everybody access but Bob, or but my finance users. What we typically do is say, okay, give me your deny ACE, I'll put it in front, deny authenticated users, and then allow Bob, or allow finance users. Well, what we've just done is we've denied authenticated users, right? And that's only one. Deny ACEs cause lots of problems. They also force us to have to walk the ACE iteratively, or consecutively, right? Because order becomes uber important when there's denies in there. Whereas we could do something like a binary search or something if there wasn't any. So we're trying to avoid deny ACEs, and that's why they're not in there.
Great.
Yes. Yeah. Now, there is a not operator, right? But, oh, wait, I might have. Okay. This is how, if you're working with Windows, this is how you do extensibility, okay? And if you're managing if you want to manage these security descriptors, one is you have the ability to use SDDL, right? And SDDL is kind of defined in MSD type and hopefully in TechNet. And that's, in fact, the primary way to do a secure conditional expression, okay? We've added a few APIs, add conditional ACE. So once you've defined your conditional expression, you'll pop it in with this API and add resource attribute ACE. Okay. Now, it's really important that you're familiar with MSD type, because that's where the best and most frequently updated document of all this stuff, of the SDDL. And the binary layout, by the way, of this stuff is also defined in there. In AD, you can use PowerShell or LDAP to manage with the claims up in AD, and central access policies, which we'll jump into in a sec, are also managed via PowerShell and LDAP. And then there's a page called Dynamic Access Control Developer Extensibility, which has kind of a jumping off point for all the different sorts of related dynamic access control technologies, because there's several kind of vectors that you can extend this in. Oh, sorry, I should have took that out. So now I'm moving into file classification infrastructure. Now, so everything what you just heard and said is kind of core, right? And those expressions and those expression aces and claims and all that, that's kind of the bedrock. And then now we're going to kind of build on that, although we won't immediately build on it, so it's going to feel like a transition into file classification infrastructure. Okay, so we kind of have to silo it after the intro, and then we'll get back to it very soon. Yes?
Very quickly, if I remember correctly, the claims are stored in the system ACL, not the discretionary ACL. Is that correct or not?
That's correct.
That is correct.
Yes.
Did they follow the same sort of inheritance mechanism that normal discretionary cases?
Yeah, good question. So his two-part question. One is, where are these stored? In the security descriptor. I already said they were in the security descriptor, and yes, as he said, they're in the SACL too. Now, the reason they're in the SACL, not the DACL, arguably we could have put them in the DACL, but that we're already used to the SACL being a highly protected security place, and who gets to change a claim might be different than who gets to write to a DACL, right? For example, you might in the future. We might change that to, well, there's certain types of claims that only a local administrator can change, whereas there's other types of claims where anybody with write DAC can change, right? So it's a security protected place. There's other stuff in there. Of course, there's a traditional home of the audit policy, but there's even yet other stuff in there, like the MIC labels and so on, okay? The other part of the question was, the inheritance story for this stuff. Yeah, it tries to mimic the inheritance of files, but it doesn't have the same. But it's not exactly the same, and that's because, for example, in file inheritance, you can have both permissions come into play, right? It's the cumulative permission of what was inherited. But here, only one central access policy is ever going to come into play, right? So the inheritance of central access policies, I got to break this into two parts, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will. Only one comes in, so they will inherit, but they will be ordered, and only the first one in the order in the SACL will be enforced in central access policy. Just in terms of, if you put these conditional expressions in ACLs, those ACLs will inherit just like they always have. Okay. Now, well, yeah, we'll get to central access policies. We're going to do file classification infrastructure first. I believe you guys are probably more familiar with this than you are with other stuff. So I'm going to go a little quicker through this, but not so quick that if you're not familiar with it, you won't get something out of it. So file classification infrastructure, or FCI, was originally released in Server 08 R2. It was a means at that point to basically tag files and then use those tags to do management, such as it's time to archive these files, or this file is about this topic, right? And that's useful for things like e-discovery later and so on, right? But it had some limitations that it always meant to add to go address. One of them was the rules can be based or tagged, classified at scheduled times and not instantaneously, or even soon. You set up your schedule, and then at 4 a.m. or whatever, it would go out and crawl and tag files, which is obviously not ideal for a security feature. It's not continuous, meaning that as the data changes, it doesn't, boom, change, right? It has to wait till schedule and reanalyze the file. Not for access control. That's kind of implied so far. People said, hey, I got all this, got HBI, why not use that for access control? And there was no UI for manual classification, because if it's going to be a security feature, at least, you're going to have to, the author is going to have to be able to say HBI, right? So in terms of the changes that came along, there's a UI and the file, in the properties tab on the file. Okay, this is there by group policy. It's smart about when it turns on. It won't show up at home. But if you're in domain and the domain has, I think, a claims dictionary or a central access policy, or yeah, a resource property dictionary, then it will pop on. Okay, so author can now manage those properties. There's yes.
The single most visible property of a file that was used as an example when we were talking earlier on about strings earlier, like years ago, that we couldn't store was what Windows always stored, and that's where you download zone. Now that used to be put in a stream, but that was a property of a file where it came from.
Sure. Arguably, yeah. Yeah.
And that zone of a file reminds me a little bit of this stuff. Now that was stored in a stream.
Yep.
Does that example, which presumably is important because Windows stuck there, fit into these kind of properties as well? You know, these zones.
Yes. Now, the question is, so hey, this reminds me of zones. That when you download a file from the internet, the system is smart enough to tag it with that it came from this internet zone. And could that be a claim? And the answer is yes, but it's not. So there's nothing to stop you from sticking a string in there called zone, but IE or the WinINet APIs don't. So that's actually a nice feature request, but they'd have to work out some issues like how relevant would it be. Right now it's the APIs that later enforce the security are looking in the data streams, so they would have to be updated. So they might not do that one because the folks consuming it are already tweaked to the way they want them. But yeah, it's a good example of something that could be a claim. Now, go ahead.
Panel you have right here. If I take this box, my Windows 8.1, whatever, and I take your box with Windows 8.1 system or Windows 2012 R2 system, and I go into a document, right mouse button, pull up the text document properties, can I, on a mount, it can be free mount, Windows 8.1 to Windows 8.1 or Windows 8.1 to some standalone server, see these.
If the UI is kind of clever about when it shows up, so the question is, when will I see this property dialog? And that it will show up, I believe, I don't, to be honest with you, remember the exact conditions, but I think they are, if you're in a domain and the domain has a claims dictionary or a resource property dictionary, which is a schema for resource properties in the domain. I think that, and then it says, oh, I'm going to show up, I'm going to put this up there. So probably not for you right now, right?
Will never show up on a standalone system?
Not on a non-domain system, no. As currently coded, no. Arguably we could have, but we just don't have a local, this kind of goes into this new part of the slide I'm on. Where are these claims defined, right? If you're going to use it for a security feature, it's not just about, we have this data archiving process and we like to tag things with what spec they are and so on, so we can do it all in our shop. Now, if we're going to use it for a security feature, we kind of have to have a consensus and an authority about what these claims, what they are, what they mean, what the possible values are. So, and that all is living in Active Directory. Now, we could factor that maybe at a server level for certain scenarios in the future, but right now it's there in Active Directory, centrally authored there and pulled down to servers. The next update is more extensibility in, well, first off, there's inbox content classifiers that have been added. We'll talk about key ones in a second. And third-party classification plugins. This is a key extensibility point for DAC, and one that people have already taken a lot of advantage of. Some real big players here. I was personally, being a security guy, I was very blown away by what I saw in this space in terms of the classification capabilities by third parties. They can take, terabytes of old data, and they could sit there and hum away. It might take them a weekend or a month to do it, but once it's done, they have all those files tagged with things like all the part numbers that they would contain, the ISO spec numbers that they might be associated with, anything that had identifiable person, credit card information, that sort of thing. I was just blown away at the layers and layers and layers of information that they can discern right? I kind of thought, well, would they, even if we do this, how smart are we going to be about going and looking at reams and reams and reams of data? Well, they're pretty smart. That's something that's been going on for a long time. And basically, we're just taking old IP and we're putting it into the security descriptors effectively instead of some database that lives off to the side. So that's really impressive and instantly mature, right? Since those guys did that, ported it to these third-party classification plugins, it's instantly mature in terms of the classifications that we're getting. The next thing is they're for security, right? That's the other enhancement here. You can use these in security. They're in the security descriptor. There's policy about who can access them. The system access check honors them. And then there's file management tasks. So you can define custom tasks, such as, hey, if I see a file tagged this way, do this. Maybe archive it if its date is past, blah, blah, blah. Or if it's got HBI, make sure it is RMS encrypted, right? That one comes in the box. But you could also have your own custom file management tasks, okay? RMS encrypt was one of the more popular requests when they released FCI originally, right? So now, as the file leaves the perimeter, you can have some encryption on it just based on the fact that it's HBI. All right, central access policies. So we're going to have to manage time. I think the central access policies are important, and I'll go through them rather quickly, and then we'll just discuss about what we want to do with time. This is kind of the new feature. Now, obviously, expressions are new, but the expressions are just a sub-feature within of the central access policies. What they are is the ability to manage access control from Active Directory over some set of files or using group policy, right? That's pretty straightforward. Policies can be defined with these conditional expressions, as we said. Now, here's the kind of the pivot. We figured that not everybody across the corp is going to have the same exact policies. So we try to make them composable, which means we add a little bit of composability, right? So there's this notion of a rule, which you see here on your left, and you see 3 rules there. One's defined as high impact data rule. Applicability predicate is if the data has been labeled as high impact. A personal information rule, if PII, if the file's been labeled PII, and then an information wall rule that says if there's a resource claim on if there's a department claim on the resource, sorry. Okay, now each one of these has its own conditions and its own access grants, right? The point is, each one of these rules can apply to completely different data and be managed by a completely different group, right? And might be there for a completely different scenario. Those can then be composed into, those rules can be composed into central access policies, right? So central access policy then, this one that I have here, the standard organization policy, is using this high impact rule and the personal information rule. And they say, we'll just put that on our file servers. And that's kind of the baseline. But the finance department says we're different. And they want to add this information wall rule to that, right? In ours, you have to be in the finance department to actually access this stuff. Once these rules are defined, then you use group policy to say what servers, OUs, you want them to go to, right? And then group policy sends them down there, and at group policy time, they become controlling access on the files. Okay, so the only new kind of concept here is that they're in Active Directory now. There's this indirection or this rules that compose into policies. Okay, and then we've introduced group policy as a way to bring these down to the servers. Okay, so now you say, well, wait, how does this integrate with what's already there, the share and the DACL, right? Well, back in the old days, you just have the share permissions and the NTFS permissions. And as you probably remember, you go there if you get access to the share. The share does actually have a throttle on it, whether it's read only or whether it's full control and such. And then after you survive that, you get your NTFS permissions. Actually, you get the intersect of those, the least of both. Well, just add to that a filter based on what's in your central access policies. Okay, so one person called this the gauntlet, this feature the gauntlet as a potential name, because it really just adds another gate, to go through. Okay, and you come out with less than you went in potentially. Okay, so chronologically, how does access check flow? Okay, so I'm on a client, I go to a file server, and first thing that happens is the share security descriptor is evaluated, just like in the olden days. Okay. That security descriptor is going to either give me, typically we say full control and then I manage it on the ACL, is what we've said in the past. So we get through that, then we go into the security descriptor on the file or folder itself. And here, the central access policies are referenced, right? And you will, if the central access policy, now note that there's a local cache of a central access policy, right? We're not going into Active Directory, it's a local cache. That group policy put there, right? And we're going to check each of the rules, and then we're going to apply to that the NTFS permissions. Now, what have we just done? So this slide, if you understand this, then you get it. Okay? So it kind of, you gird up a little bit because I sometimes even screw this up as I take you through it, but it's not that hard. Just if you get this though, you get central access policies. So imagine that there's a file out there in the world that has on it a department equals engineering and sensitivity equals high. And then imagine, part of it is just the understanding this slide. Imagine there's 3 different users trying to access this, and we're trying to show what their experience would be, all right? So on the permissions on the share are everyone full control standard guidance, right? So what's going to happen is when we go hit the share, everybody potentially gets full control, right? Now, a central access policy is applied for which there's 3 rules. The first one's in that first line there. And that one says target files applicability predicate is engineering. And engineering folks get modify, and everyone gets read. Now remember, look up at our file again that has department equals engineering and sensitivity equals high, right? So based on that, what's the engineering FTE going to get? Make a choice and stick with it. And now, oh, I went too far. They're going to get modify. So it does apply. Engineering department, it does apply. The applicability predicate says true. It grants modify to everyone in engineering FTEs and vendors, and it grants read to everyone else. Okay, so you see how this, you got to stop and think, but it's not that hard, right? So then rule 2 says, for sensitive data, where sensitivity is equal to high, FTEs get modify. So, all right, take your choice, right? Engineering FTEs get modified. Comes right out of FTE, gets modified, right? Now note that now the vendors aren't going to get modify from that, right? And sales, potentially, from this particular rule, would get modify. Okay, there's going to be a composite later, but from this rule, they would get modify. Hope that makes sense. Now, this next one, oh, I took away the surprise. Department equals sales, right, on this next rule, and that would give sales modify. So what's going to happen here? As I've already showed you, nothing. The rule steps into the background, says, I don't count. Actually, access check says you don't count because you don't apply. And then there's the ACL, which gives which gives what? Modify to vendors, to FTE, and read to vendors, right? So that one gives our FTE both in sales and engineering modify, and vendors get read. So the cumulative access now, the effective access, right? For FTE, engineering FTE, anyone? Engineering vendor? And sales FTE. Good call. Okay? So there's a matrix there, and while we were able to go through it and get it, you might be saying to yourself, I'm not so sure I'm excited about this feature anymore, because that's kind of complex, right? Yes?
I noticed the first thing I noticed from that is that when I think of complicated actors that involve pouring in permission from various groups, here we're handing in permission from various groups. So we're now doing the opposite of what we did with groups.
I don't know if and or are opposites per se, but they were doing certainly different stuff.
If you're a member of group engineering and group sales, and I give group engineering read permission, I would have to kind of deny for you not to have read permission. If you're a member of both groups and one of them granted you permission, I'd have to have some denies.
Back in the day.
Back in the day.
Yeah, or you would have to have defined your group such that they never got access in the first place. You never gave them access in the first place, right? Which led to you defining more groups.
But generally, if you define Jeremy a member of one group and you a member of another group, both of you are going to have access to the document if both groups have.
If both groups have access, yes. Now, by virtue of these ands, we don't have to make another group. We get the intersect of groups, right? So, good. But it does add conditional expressions, which are a layer of complexity. That's true. And for that, since we might be saying, oh boy, ACLs are already kind of complex, we have this notion called access denied remediation. Now, I talked about that earlier, right? And what that is where the admin can say, now the app has to be wired for this, right? But and Explorer is, but the admin can give some text that says, hey, here's what typically happens if you don't have access. Maybe you're not using your smart card, right? Or maybe you're accessing from a client that's not managed, right? You might say, oh, that's right, I got to go do that. So maybe you can self-remediate, right? Or it could have, go ask Bob, right? Or it could say, click here and we'll send email to the data owner, which can be configured on the file share, okay? So there is more help than there's been in the past. Okay, now staging. Yes, question?
How do you map from the object app to specific remediation types?
On the share, there's associated at the share level. So we figure out what share the user came in through. Oh, question was, how do you map, how does the implementation map from the file that was attempted to be accessed to the remediation policy, including the text and linkage? And that is, it's associated with the share. We figure out what share that the user, SMB share the user came in through. No, that's something that's on the file server. It's the file remediation policy is configured on the file server. It's a file server feature. It can be distributed via file server.
How does an application get that remediation?
Well, think of file server and Explorer as a aware application.
Yes.
Right.
How does it get the text?
How does it? Oh, we added a API for it to get the text. I should have maybe added that slide. But there. I'm sorry.
I don't care about your APIs. What happens on the wire?
Oh, there is a an RPC call to go get. Yeah, or maybe DCOM. I did RPC DCOM call. Yeah.
And that would be incredibly helpful, maybe later if now, is from what you see transferred between the server and the client. Because server-initiated communication is really weird in this world, right? Almost all communication except release breaks in our world.
Yeah, in our world, almost all communication is client-initiated.
This is also client-initiated. It's not server-initiated.
Well, we tried to open a file. The server is going to give us a remediation.
No, it's going to give you access denied, and then the client has to look up.
So on access denied, the client is doing some remediation-related RPC call. Please help me, server.
I think so. That part, that's dusting some cobwebs I'm not super confident of, but I think that's the case.
Yeah, so maybe at some point afterwards, if you don't have it here, we'd really like to get sort of a, the 5-line message analyzer. What does this look like on the wire when you see remediation occurring?
Yes. In this deck, I have a pointer to several different resources. And through that pointer, I believe, you'll be able to get to the file share extensibility, which at least points out the API, but also, I believe, to the actual protocol doc that will have that that message defined. So that's kind of worst case scenario. I don't think there's anybody here that I'm aware of that can confidently speak to that, exactly what that, because I'm more of a security side guy than a file server guy, and that was more of a file server feature in terms of whether it was push or pull or what.
Yeah, and the other related thing is the properties about this object, right? It's confidential or whatever, were generated somehow and then saved in locally on the server for that object. Well, but group policy is on the domain controller. The group policy may have resulted in generating something for the file that says, hey, you know, for whatever reason, I scanned through it and it said confidential, therefore I'm going to mark the document as confidential in its attributes somewhere. And I assume that's more or less part of the ACL in a sense. One of the things that's really important to understand at a very high level is, even if you weren't talking about enforcement, if you're just trying to back this stuff up, let's say, what does that look like on the wire? What RPC call? Because that tells us what document to look in. You know, what RPC call do I use if I wanted to view that stuff and back it up, let's say? Because at that point, we now understand a little bit about how it's stored, how it's accessed. Admittedly, we don't know without looking at the domain controller and Active Directory how it's generated, but understanding sort of, this is we're file people, right? So for file people, this is just metadata. And sort of understanding where the metadata is exposed helps us to frame the whole discussion. And also know which document to go look in.
Yes. So, partial answer. And backing up and restoring Active Directory is not changed. It's just what it was. It just includes more stuff, right? And I don't know how granular Active Directory gets in its backup and restores, but at least it gives you the total backup. Files haven't changed in that the backup and restore privileges give you the permission to backup and restore the security descriptors. And all this stuff is in the security descriptors. Now,
we're unable to hear on the call.
There is a little bit of file, like for example, the access denied remediation GUI that's on. I mentioned isn't in Active Directory; it's on the server. That is going to be a backup file server story, which I can't give you a complete answer on, right? Unfortunately. But there is a means to back up a file server. I just don't know it. Now, we'll jump into questions, but you've got to see the staging. That's important. We can cut the Kerberos stuff, and because Mitch already kind of talked about that, it's nice to see it from a DAC perspective, but you'll get it right out of the slides if you get these slides. But we do got to get through staging because that's completely different. So I don't know if you guys have ever messed with ACLs and then put them on files before, and then got a surprise in terms of what the access was, right? There are lots of horror stories about people that shut down businesses because by doing that, by broad authorization changes. And here we're talking about central access policies, which is by definition semi-broad, right? So how do I deploy that with a degree of confidence that I'm not going to get fired? And the answer is staging policies, right? Now, what this is really just imagine, I'll simplify it, that right next to a central access policy, there is a staging policy. The first central access policy might be null. So it does do what you previously would have done if you were just ACLs. And then there's a staging policy that has some significant rules in it, right? So we would just push that down as part of this now broader central access policy, right? Not broader, larger central access policy, okay? And what we'll do is we'll create an audit. It's not live. It's not controlling access. It is live in the sense that it's there getting staging data, but it's not live in that it's not controlling access to the file. It's just there so the system can say, well, what's the difference if this were live, right? So that is an example one, which is different from our existing one, right? But conceptually, it's really just a different policy. So this is a trimmed down policy so that it's easier to see certain things, such as what's going to be in this audit, and that is what's the security identifier, who's getting access, who's getting different. Otherwise, who would have gotten different access had this policy been live? In this case, Alice. What's the object, right? In this case, finance report. And what's the difference? Or what were the actual access that Alice got, and what's the difference? Okay? So you can now see that depending on your time horizon that you got to get this policy deployed, you can get this defined and let this run for a while as a staging policy and collect maybe a week or a month of data, see if who doesn't or who does get access, and determine whether or not that was what you wanted, right? Which gives you, now, that's better than the other solution, which is have a staging environment, right? And those are expensive, and they're never ideal because it's different data, staging data. Right? Yes?
So the SACL on the file is the same whether it's staging or real, and the ACL evaluator on the server then makes the decision whether to disallow or allow access based on group policy that's been pushed to it?
Effectively, now, but in order to make everything fast at runtime,
yeah,
there's a lot of caching done. Okay.
Yeah, but I'm just saying. So you've already put all the new policy ACLs on the file. They're just the ACL evaluator that's running on the server just doesn't enforce them until it sees that the policy has gone live and real.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay, got it.
Well, yes. Now remember, it's scoped to that particular group policy container, right? And just to give you a little more there, it actually lives in the registry, and then we pull it into the security resource manager monitor. We don't actually look in the registry at runtime access check. It's actually living in kernel.
Yeah. So it just generates an audit event rather than an access denied.
Yes.
Yeah. Got it.
Question. In theory.
The add symbol on the applies to was not on the previous one. Is that there any significance to that? It was not on the original applies to example that you gave in the previous one.
Oh, this one is being a little more low level.
Okay, so it's just specific to the syntax.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not a distinction between staging or not.
No, good questions. Yeah, the question is, why is there an at in this example when on slide 3-ish I had an example central access policy that didn't have that? And yeah, this one is just showing you a little bit more of the SDDL than the previous one. Okay, so this is a good place to stop, given that we're hurting on time, and given that Mitch has already introduced you to this, I believe. There is, in terms of some questions about token bloat, right? And that is, I'll just mention that these claims with respect to token bloat, in addition to the things that have been done to Kerberos in order to reduce the existing token bloat problem, a lot of the existing token bloat problem was because of, in theory, was because of resource groups, or domain, what do we call them, domain local groups, right, or resource domain groups. Those are now compressed as of Server 2012, R2. So Kerberos has done these things. There's also some limits and some buffers that have just been increased. That the 1024 home domain limit has been removed. There's a few limits that might still come into play as they were from the olden days, which is universal groups still might create problems because they can still grow. Now, with respect to the claims impact on the token, the claims there's certainly more data there. So there's certainly more token there, right? They are compressed. It's all text, and it all compresses like text compresses. So, our experience is as it compresses pretty well. And there's also new audits in place so that you can monitor the thresholds now. So that if you're approaching a token bloat problem, you'll get a warning ahead of time, and instead of just one day the administrator, somebody important can't log on. Okay, but we haven't seen spikes of going from 2K or 3K tokens suddenly to 12. That hasn't happened. Now, in theory, you could throw enough claims in there to do it, but it hasn't been problem as of yet. So we're done, minus questions. Yes?
Very general, high level. This is available Windows 2012 and above.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, okay. I'll flow through some stuff. See, these look just like what Mitch said.
And more of the question is just purely selfish. This is a lot of work for me to implement, so how long can I put it off before everyone in the world's using it?
Depends on how long you put it off. I will get there. Okay, went through that. So if you get the deck, you can actually look at some real evaluations of that. Now, this is where I was going. Let's say I just wanted to use, remember I made a point how you don't even have to use claims. You could just use and groups. If you want to do that, all you need is the file server to be server 2012. And it works today, right? If the file server is server 2012, right? That's kind of the first stage there. And if you want to use resource attributes, that's 2012 plus a schema update in Active Directory, okay? If you want to use central policies, central access policies, right, or user claims, now you need some Windows 2012 R2 DCs in play, right? Because they're the only ones that can issue that. And now there is a story I didn't mention for what if the client's down level. That was in the Kerberos flows that I skipped, but Mitch kind of pointed to this. I'll call it out. That we actually use Kerberos extensions to go back and get you from a Windows 8 DC to get you your claims. We'll do an S4U log on. We'll swap that token for the other token, and we'll use that one. So even if the client's down level, as long as you have claims in an up-level DC, you can get that, right? And that only requires up-level DCs. Now, if you want device claims, that requires Kerberos compound authentication, which requires Kerberos clients to know about it, which requires Windows 8 clients. Okay? Any other questions? Yes?
Is compound authentication where device claims, I assume, are right word, audited, secure, whatever. I mean, where device claims can be trusted. Are those available from any KDCs right now other than Microsoft Windows? Like something in MIT and Heimdall and the other guys?
Yeah. The question is, does anybody else issue these claims either via Curb or via some other protocol that would allow for them to be the same policy to be used? Am I fair?
Yeah, although to be honest, really what I'm saying is you got a special pack, I assume, that allows this compounding, a more complicated ticket that has things relating to your device as well as things relating to your user authenticated ticket. So you now, in effect, have two tickets, a device ticket and a user ticket, sort of.
Sure.
Is there anybody else in the world other than Windows 8 and Windows 2012 R2, let's say MIT, for example, that supports that concept?
When I was there, we were talking to folks about that. I don't remember. Mitch, do you have any comment on that? Okay, we talked to several folks. There are several folks that did implement translating things like execml to Windows policies so that you can have the Uber execml policy, and then that would push to central access policies, and those would then on Windows servers could be consumed. We also talked to, and I wish Nir was here for this, NFS servers that basically have to be able to do stuff. And
by the way, I'm on the call if you need anything from me.
I heard something on the speaker. And so they've integrated things. And then, of course, there's people that have added down-level UIs and people that have added authorization queries. But in terms of somebody that's added NFS servers that are meant to work in a Windows kind of environment, I think that does exist. At least they were actively talking to Nir, so I think that does exist. But in terms of another, like another domain, and like an Oracle domain or something like that, I don't know of any.
Using your example, NFS requires Kerberos. If Active Directory is their KDC,
Mm-hmm.
and MIT Kerberos supported this, an NFS client could produce such a compounded ticket. Active Directory DC would support it. Wouldn't necessarily require an MIT server to support it, but if the MIT client were updated, then your example of NFS being able to use this.
Yes, certainly.
That's
Certainly, it's all a well-documented protocol.
not an IETF thing?
No, it is to some degree. You want to talk to that? What degree of this Kerberos extension is IETF? And actually, repeat the question too while you're at it.
Yeah, because I always forget that. So the question is this an IETF thing? And so the FAST protocol is a standard. And when we worked on FAST, one of the things we did talk about is the use of explicit armoring. Earlier drafts actually talk about explicit armoring, but is not in the final one, which is why if you read the technical document, we explain how to determine what the key for explicit armoring is. And it's basically that concept that we talked about during the FAST design, which is what we use for compounding, is rather than using what would be the user's granting ticket for the armoring, you can explicitly use a different ticket, which in this case would be the device, and that way you have two identities that you can then, in the final leg, when you create a service ticket, combine those together into the pack data so that the NT access token can have both properties of the client and properties of the device which the client is coming from available. So it is a Microsoft extension. A lot of Microsoft extensions do end up going into other versions of Kerberos, but at this time I double checked. It doesn't look like that's necessarily in plan, but if that's needed, then MIT is usually pretty open to doing those kind of updates.
So it is certainly documented in our protocol documentation.
Yes, and it uses an extension which was designed for this kind of thing. So. And
it uses the FAST extension, which was designed for this sort of thing. All right. Any more questions? All right. That's it. Thanks.